Week before my brother's wedding, I found out I wasn't invited. Not from him, from a text message his fiancée sent me, using his phone. I still have it saved. I've read it probably 200 times since then, turning it over in my mind like a stone you keep finding in your pocket. Lena, Marcus wanted me to tell you that he's decided to keep the wedding small. Just close family and a few friends. He thinks it'll be less stressful for everyone if you're not there. Please don't reach out to him about this. He needs space. I read it standing in the parking lot of the Walgreens near my apartment, holding a bag with a birthday card for my coworker and a bottle of shampoo. The sky was that flat gray it gets in Cincinnati in early November. I stood there for a long time. Marcus is my older brother. He's 34. I'm 28. Growing up, it was the two of us against everything, against the chaos of our parents' divorce when I was 9, against the years of shuffling between two houses, against the particular loneliness of being the kids nobody quite knew how to talk about at family dinners. He taught me how to drive in an empty church parking lot. He called me every Sunday for 6 years when he was living in Columbus. When I moved into my first apartment, he drove 3 hours with a borrowed truck and we ate pizza on the floor, because I didn't have furniture yet. So when I read that text, my first instinct wasn't even anger. It was confusion, like someone had handed me a document in a language I didn't speak and told me to sign it. I typed back okay because I didn't know what else to say, and then I stood there until a woman pushing a cart asked if I was all right, and I told her yes, and I drove home. I didn't call Marcus. The text said not to reach out, and some part of me, the part that had spent a childhood trying not to make things harder, just went quiet and did what it was told. I need to back up and tell you about Melissa, because none of this makes sense without her. Marcus started dating her about 2 years ago. He met her at a work conference in Nashville. She's in corporate HR, he's in project management, and apparently they bonded over a terrible panel discussion about workflow optimization. He was happy in a way I hadn't seen him in a while. He'd been through a tough breakup a few years before, the kind that leaves a person a little hollowed out. And when he talked about Melissa, his voice had this lightness to it that I genuinely loved hearing. I wanted to like her. I tried. The thing is, Melissa is one of those people who is very warm in a way that's hard to argue with, but leaves you feeling slightly off balance. She hugs you when she sees you and asks about your life in detail and remembers everything you've told her. Your job, your friends, the name of your cat. But when I was actually in her presence, I always felt like I was being assessed, like there was a clipboard somewhere. The first time I noticed something was wrong was Thanksgiving, a year into them dating. Marcus and I had always done Thanksgiving together at my apartment or his. We'd cook too much food and watch football, even though neither of us really follows football, and call our dad and then our mom separately, because they still can't be in the same room even after 19 years. It was our thing. Small, a little scrappy, completely ours. That year, Melissa suggested they host at Marcus's place in Westerville and invite her parents, her sister's husband and kids. Which is completely reasonable. People blend families. That's what you do. I said that sounded great. I drove up and brought a sweet potato casserole that I'd made from scratch. And I spent the whole day feeling like a guest at someone else's party. Melissa's mother kept calling me Marcus's little sister in a tone that made it feel like a medical condition. Melissa organized everything and was charming and competent, and I kept catching her watching me in the way you watch something you haven't decided about yet. On the drive home, I told myself I was being unfair. She made Marcus happy. That was what mattered. But then small things started happening. Marcus would mention plans we'd made and then text me a few days before to cancel. Always with a reason, always apologetic, always a little vague. A weekend trip we talked about to visit our dad in Dayton got pushed back twice, and then quietly disappeared. He stopped calling on Sundays. I told myself he was busy, that this was what happened when your sibling got serious with someone, that I needed to be a grown-up about it. And I was. I really was trying. Then he got engaged, and I found out about it on Instagram. Not from a phone call, not from a text, from a post Melissa put up. A picture of her hand with a very nice ring, captioned, "She said yes," with a heart, and Marcus tagged. I liked it from my couch at 11 at night, feeling like the floor had dropped an inch. I texted him immediately, "Congratulations. When did this happen? Call me." He texted back a thumbs up and said he'd call soon. He called 4 days later and the conversation was strange, warm on the surface but somehow thin, like we were reading from a script of how this conversation was supposed to go rather than actually having it. I asked him when it had happened. He said 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. He'd waited 3 weeks to tell me. I told myself it didn't mean anything. I told myself I was being sensitive. After the text about the wedding, I went through a week of just functioning. I went to work. I do project coordination for a mid-sized construction firm, lots of spreadsheets, lots of emails, a job I'm good at even when my head is somewhere else. I went to the gym. I fed my cat, Biscuit, who has no patience for human emotional crises and simply wants to be fed on schedule. I told exactly one person, my friend Danny, and she sat with me in my kitchen and said something is wrong here in a way that made me feel less like I was losing my mind. Because that was the thing. The rational part of my brain kept trying to construct an explanation. Maybe Marcus really did want a small wedding. Maybe he was overwhelmed. Maybe he'd said something to Melissa about feeling stressed about family dynamics, and she'd taken it further than he meant. Maybe. But I knew my brother. And a text saying, "Please don't reach out to him." That was not Marcus. Marcus solves things by talking. Always has. Even when we were kids and he was furious with me for breaking his bike, he came and sat on my bed and we talked about it for an hour. He doesn't go silent. He doesn't use messengers. So on a Thursday night, 10 days after the text, I did something I'd been telling myself not to do. I drove to Westerville. I didn't call first. I know how that sounds. But I knew if I called, Melissa would answer or Marcus would warn her, and whatever version of reality she'd constructed around him would be in place before I got there. I needed to see his face. I needed to talk to him the way we used to talk, without a buffer. I parked on the street outside his house. The lights were on. His truck was in the driveway. I sat in my car for probably 15 minutes just breathing. And then I got out and knocked on the door. Melissa answered. She was holding a dish towel and her expression did something complicated in the half second before she smoothed it. "Lena, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to Marcus," I said. Just that, I kept my voice level. "He's eating dinner." "This isn't really a good time." "That's okay. I can wait." She didn't move. She stood in the doorway with the dish towel in her hands and looked at me the way you look at a weather forecast you were hoping would change. "He doesn't want to see you right now, Lena." "I thought I made that clear." "You made it clear," I said. "But I'd like to hear that from him." There was a silence. Behind her, I could hear the television, some cooking competition show, something with an audience, and then I heard Marcus's voice from somewhere in the house saying who's at the door. Melissa turned her head slightly but didn't step back. "Just someone from the neighborhood," she said. And something locked into place for me right then. Just someone from the neighborhood. I was his sister and she had just called me. Just someone from the neighborhood. I said his name loudly enough that he would hear it. There was a pause, then footsteps. Then Marcus appeared behind her shoulder, and his face when he saw me. It broke my heart and answered everything at the same time. He looked confused. Genuinely confused. Not guilty, not caught. Confused. "Lena, what's going on?" "I got a text from your phone," I said, "saying you didn't want me at the wedding." He stared at me. "What? 10 days ago?" "From your number. Melissa said you wanted to keep it small." He turned to look at her. Something passed between them that I couldn't read. Then he stepped around her and opened the door wider and said, "Come inside." We sat at the kitchen table, the three of us. The cooking show was still on in the other room. Melissa was very still in the way that very controlled people get still when things are moving faster than they planned. Marcus had his phone in his hand. I'd screenshot the text and airdropped it to him, and he was staring at it the way you stare at something that has no business existing. "I didn't send this," he said. "I know," I said. He looked up at Melissa. His voice was quiet, which somehow made it worse. "Did you send this?" She started to say something about how she was just trying to manage his stress, how she knew how anxious he got about family stuff, how she was trying to protect the peace they'd worked so hard to build. She said it all in a very calm, very reasonable voice, and I noticed she was looking at Marcus, not at me, making it a conversation between them rather than an accounting to both of us. Marcus put the phone down on the table very carefully. "You sent a text from my phone to my sister, telling her she wasn't invited to our wedding," he said, "without telling me. I was going to tell you when." She was quiet. Was this the only one? He was still looking at her. Was this the only one? He was still looking at her. Was this the only message you sent? And here's the thing about a person who's been carefully managing information. They're not prepared for the moment when the question gets asked directly and plainly by someone they can't deflect. Melissa had answers for most things. She was genuinely good at it. But Marcus wasn't asking for an explanation. He was asking for a count, and the way she didn't answer immediately told both of us what we needed to know. It came out over the next hour. Not all of it. I don't think we got all of it that night. But enough. A voicemail she'd deleted. A message to our dad from Marcus's email that apparently said Marcus was too busy with the engagement to be in touch much and not to worry if he was quiet for a while. A reply she'd sent to a text from me 4 months earlier when I'd texted Marcus about coming to Cincinnati for my birthday. That said, "Gonna have to skip it this year. Things are crazy." I'd assumed he'd just been busy. He'd had no idea I'd invited him. Marcus kept saying, "I don't understand," in this voice that was very quiet and a little broken, and I sat there and did not say anything because it wasn't my moment to say anything. This was between them. Melissa cried. She said she loved him and had been scared of losing him, and that she'd seen how his family relationships stressed him out, and she just wanted to simplify things. She said she was sorry. She looked at me once, briefly, and said she was sorry to me too. I believed she was sorry. I believed she meant it. I also believed it didn't change what she'd done. Marcus asked me to give them some time alone. I drove back to Cincinnati that night, 3 hours through the dark on 71, and cried for about the first 40 minutes and then felt strangely hollow and then put on a podcast about true crime and just drove. I want to be honest about the next few weeks because it wasn't a movie. There was no clean resolution, no scene where everything clicked back into place. Marcus called me 2 days later and talked for a long time about how he'd had no idea, about how he was furious and also confused and also grieving something, about how he didn't know what came next. He kept saying I should have noticed, and I kept telling him that she'd been careful and it wasn't his fault, and we both knew the truth was somewhere in the middle of those two things. He and Melissa didn't break up immediately. That part surprised people when I told them later, but I understood it, even if it hurt. 2 years is a long time. An engagement is a long time. And Marcus processes things slowly and carefully, the way he's always done. He needed to sit with it. He needed to understand what had actually happened before he decided what to do about it. What he did do right away was call our dad. He explained the email. Our dad, who is 61 and gruff and not great at talking about feelings, but loves us in this stubborn, inarticulate way, got very quiet and then said she did that in a voice I wasn't there for. But Marcus described to me, and which I have thought about many times since. He also called me every day for 2 weeks. Not long calls, sometimes just 10 minutes. But he called. The Sunday calls came back. It felt like someone had turned a light back on in a room that had been dark for so long, I'd almost forgotten it used to be bright. The wedding did happen. It was postponed by 4 months. Marcus needed the time, and I think part of him needed to see if Melissa could show him something different in those months, something that explained or redeemed what she'd done. I don't know everything about what happened between them during that time. He shared what he wanted to share. What I know is that the wedding was much smaller than originally planned. Melissa's mother was not invited. 3 of the 4 people from Melissa's original guest list, who'd been there for some of the access to Marcus's phone, were quietly removed. It was a Saturday in March at a small venue outside Columbus, about 60 people, with wild flowers on the tables and a playlist that Marcus and I had actually argued affectionately about for 2 weeks. I was the maid of honor. I know how that sounds, given everything. And I won't pretend I didn't sit with that decision for a long time. Or that there wasn't a version of me that wanted to stay home and protect myself from any further proximity to Melissa. But Marcus asked me, and the way he asked me, sitting at my kitchen table in February with biscuit on his lap and his voice a little unsteady, made it impossible to say no. He said, "You're the person I should have been talking to this whole time. I want you up there." So I stood up there, in a dress the color of dusty sage that Melissa and I had actually picked out together at a bridal shop in Easton, in one of the stranger afternoons of my life. She was careful with me. She was measured and thoughtful, and I could see her trying in every small gesture. And I was careful with her, too. I don't know what that becomes over time. I don't know what I owe her or what she owes me, or how the math of all of it works out in the end. I know that when the officiant got to the part about showing up for each other through hard things, Marcus looked at me from the altar and not at his best man or the crowd, just for 1 second. And I held it because it was mine. I told you at the beginning, I've read that text 200 times. That's true, but I read it differently now than I did in that Walgreens parking lot. The first 100 times I read it as a wound, evidence of how easily I could be erased, how little my place in my own family was guaranteed, how one person with access to a phone could pull a thread and unravel things I thought were permanent. Now I read it more like a moment of clarification, because here's what I know. Melissa could send that text because she had correctly identified something real, that Marcus and I had drifted, that we weren't talking the way we used to, that the distance had grown wide enough to be plausible. She didn't create that distance from nothing. It already existed and she used it. Which means the actual thing that was at risk wasn't just my invitation to a wedding. It was the assumption that the people we love know we love them, without us having to keep proving it. Marcus and I talk every Sunday again. Last week he called me from the hardware store to ask what color I thought he should paint his back porch, and we argued about gray versus green for 20 minutes, and I thought about the church parking lot where he taught me to drive, the two of us in our dad's old sedan, him saying, "You got it, Lena. You got it," and I was grateful, not for any dramatic reconciliation, not for a villain being defeated, but for something much quieter and more durable than that. For my brother on the phone, talking about paint colors on a Sunday afternoon, for knowing that if I knocked on his door, he would answer it. I've thought a lot about why things went the way they did, not in an obsessive way, but in the way you turn something over when you're trying to actually understand it rather than just survive it. What Melissa did was wrong. I'm not going to soften that or find a more charitable frame for it. She took access she was trusted with and used it to quietly dismantle something that wasn't hers to touch. The relationship between Marcus and me, the Sunday calls, the standing plans, the way we showed up for each other, that was built over decades of actual living together and apart. She didn't build it. She had no right to take it. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. She couldn't have done it if the door hadn't already been open. Marcus and I had drifted before Melissa came along, not dramatically, not with any single rupture, just the slow, quiet drift that happens when two people get busy with their own lives and stop being intentional about staying connected. I told myself it was normal. I told myself I was being mature about it, and I was. But I was also just letting it happen, which is different from choosing it. Melissa saw that gap and walked through it. That's on her. But the gap was real, and that part is on both of us. I think about the version of me that read that text in the Walgreens parking lot and typed back okay and went home. That version of me had spent a long time making herself small, to avoid causing trouble. It was a habit I'd built in childhood. When your family is in chaos, you learn to take up less space, to swallow things, to not be the one who makes it worse. And for years, I'd carried that habit into adulthood without examining it. Without asking whether the situation actually called for it. Going to Marcus's house that night was the first time in a long time I did something because it was right rather than because it was comfortable. I drove 3 hours round trip on a Thursday night because I knew in my gut that the version of events I'd been handed was not the truth. Not because I had proof yet. Just because I knew my brother. That's what I mean when I say intelligence isn't just about information. It's about trusting what you actually know. I knew Marcus. I had 30 years of evidence about who he was and how he handled things. One text from his number couldn't overwrite that, but I had to be willing to act on what I knew, not just carry it around quietly. And the courage part, the showing up at the door part, that wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel brave in the moment. It felt terrifying and a little embarrassing, and I sat in my car for 15 minutes before I got out. Courage almost never feels like courage while you're doing it. It usually just feels like deciding to do the uncomfortable thing anyway. What I want anyone watching this to take from it is simple. The people who matter to you are not permanent by default. You have to keep choosing them. You have to keep showing up. Not just when there's a crisis, not just when it's easy, but in the ordinary Sundays and the small phone calls and the arguments about porch paint colors that turn out to be the whole thing. Marcus and I almost lost each other to silence. Not to a fight, not to some dramatic falling out. Just to drift and to someone who saw that drift and used it. Don't let the drift go unaddressed. The person worth keeping is worth the uncomfortable call, the 3-hour drive, the knock on the door,